Today is the 14th of July 2021. My name is Norbert Meyn and I'm here in Cambridge today to talk to Julia Seiber Boyd. Hello Julia.
Hello Norbert, nice to see you again.
We're here to talk about your father, the composer Mátyás Seiber, and about your mother, Lilla Bauer, who was a dancer. But first I would like to ask a few questions about you. Could we start with when and where you were born?
I was born in late February in 1949 in Guy's Hospital in London, and then I grew up in Caterham in Surrey, which is a small, not particularly interesting but quite leafy town, and we had two houses there, moving from one to the other when I was about 4 on Coronation Day, so that my father had enough space to build his music room next to the larger house to which we moved.
What was it like to grow up with a mother who was a dancer and a father who was a composer?
Well, I didn't know any other, I suppose, but it dawned on me it was a little strange that my father was there most of the time, whereas my mother, after I was 2, I suppose, was not. She was teaching in London, whereas my father taught quite a lot of the time from home, although he also went to Morley College. And I had a nanny, I think, the first year, and then we had 3 Danish au pairs after that. And yeah, it was a very nice childhood.
So let's carry on talking about your father's family back in Budapest and his upbringing, how he grew up there, and the music in the house.
That I know very little about because he never spoke about it. I know that his mother was a piano teacher. I know that his sister Maria was the first woman to complete the course at the Academy for organists. So they were obviously very musical, and his brother, I don't know if he went to the Academy or not, but he then had his music production company.
We have a text that was recently translated from Hungarian by your father's brother-in-law, Kereszteri, if I pronounce his name correctly, and he talks about how your grandmother or your father's mother was actually a concert pianist before.
Yes, as well
she had a family.
Teacher, yes.
That she composed her own songs to texts of Heine, and that the whole family played music, that there was a photograph where everybody had an instrument and was playing an instrument.
Yes.
And he also pointed out that after the First World War, teaching music became a source of income for the family when the family's wealth took a hit from the circumstances, I'm sure. So music was very important then, of course, already.
Yes, and they must have been reasonably well off. I dare say chief railway engineer was quite well paid. But the house on my father's birth certificate in District 6 is not the same where they then moved to, which is very upmarket, up near the Kodály Korund in Bengszor utca, which is quite a large block of flats.
And what about languages? Which languages were spoken in this home?
Certainly Hungarian, first language. Anybody who was anything in Hungary had to speak German as well, because all documents were in German. And when he acquired his other languages, I don't know, apart from one of his school reports as outstanding in Latin and maths. Nothing about music. So Latin, clearly, Greek, French, Italian, Dutch, a couple of others. But when he was killed in South Africa, he'd been there for 3 weeks, and clearly he would have learnt Afrikaans in that time. There's this wonderful story of him going to a music festival in Oslo in 1954, and people were having a good time in the bar. He was sitting in the corner with a book, and when they arrived, he was seen to be speaking to somebody, a local, in Norwegian. Somebody from the band said to him, "I didn't know you spoke Norwegian, Mátyás." He said, "I learnt it on the way here."
So his facility for languages was a significant factor in his life.
Yes, certainly.
He, of course, went into music and he got accepted in the music academy. He was only 15 years old when he got accepted into the academy.
I think that's right, because you would have started that in parallel with being in the high school, and then you would have transferred to the academy full time. So Kodály was his tutor, yes.
Zoltán Kodály, if that's the way to pronounce his full name. That is a rather well-known class, the class of Kodály. They were roaming around the countryside, the different parts of the country in Hungary, collecting folk music. Yeah. But there was more to it. It wasn't just the folk connection as well, the training.
No, Kodály was very keen to record the oral music, which was obviously passed down from one generation to another, but never written down. So he was keen to record all of that, and they went all round Hungary and to neighbouring countries as well. And it was known as the class of 25, because 1925 was the last year he was at the academy. Antal Dorati was also in that class.
He studied cello and he studied composition.
Yes.
He played cello and professionally for a lot of his time, and also composition-wise he already was quite mature while he was a student and wrote some of his pieces. And there is this one story of the Serenade for Wind Sextet.
The Wind Sextet,
which he entered in a competition. Bartók, who was also part of this circle, and he refused to not let it win and resigned from the jury.
Bartók was on the judging panel, and because the rest of the panel wouldn't let the Wind Sextet win, Bartók resigned.
That must have been quite an experience for the young Mátyás Seiber to have Hungary's primary composer say that this piece must win this competition and refuse to let anybody else win. I would think he must have gained quite a lot of confidence from that already. He must have known that he was onto something as a composer.
He certainly didn't lack the confidence as a composer, no. And the Bartók family apparently always liked to use the leichte Tänze for piano practice as a whole family.
That's the leichte Tänze which he wrote in the Frankfurt period, which have a bit of jazz in them.
Well, there are a series of dances.
Yeah, all dances.
Yes,
But we will talk about that in a moment. Now, I'm just trying to think about the circumstances, of course, in Budapest when your father was studying there. And the fact that he was of Jewish descent, the Jewishness didn't play a particularly big role in the family's
no, not at all.
life.
He certainly had no books in Hebrew that I've ever seen.
But he was, of course, identified as Jewish by some.
He was, yes.
And that had consequences for his life, not only in Budapest, but certainly in Frankfurt later on.
Yeah.
So let's talk about his time in Frankfurt. So he moved there. He had already written his first string quartet, and he moved there in 1925 at the age of 20. So what do you know about his time in Frankfurt?
Well, I know more about it from 1927 to 1933, which was the time he was professor of jazz. I think he went very briefly in 25, but then he went on to the ships. And he was playing cello in a string quartet for the first-class passengers on the America-Hamburg line.
That's quite grand, isn't it? To sort of, to travel, in style and play the cello. And he encountered jazz on these journeys. There may have, either on the boat, there may have been some jazz musicians on the boat.
Yes, I think on the boat and probably in the States as well, because he became quite interested in not only jazz but also blues and penitential singing.
So you do actually have some documents of this of these journeys from the Hamburg America line. There was sort of like a passport for him to travel with, and this is a nice story to tell, really, how somebody who would study music in Hungary picks up jazz and then becomes the first ever professor of jazz in a conservatoire. anywhere in the world.
It's the first academic study of jazz anywhere, yes.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about this jazz class for a bit. So obviously in Frankfurt he must have made very good connections, and one of the connections there was with Seklers, who was also, he was also Jewish, but he was also, he had grown up there in the Hoch Conservatoire as a professor, and he obviously had the vision to see what adding a jazz class to the conservatoire could actually achieve, and how that training, and especially rhythm, I think, and just the general sort of skill that's involved was judged to be beneficial.
Certainly the rhythm, and Dad is a good mathematician. Rhythm was very important, yes. And one of his articles, then, Rhythmic Studies in Jazz, has been translated into many languages. But what he composed while he was there is less clear. Certainly the Leichtertanzer came out then, although I think some of them had happened before. While he was still at the academy, there's not only the first string quartet, but also the Missa Brevis, which I'm not sure if it was Bartók or Kodály said was extremely profound. And a couple of other things he wrote apart from the sextet while he was still there. Then he goes to Frankfurt, and yes, apart from the Leichtertanzer, it's not quite clear what comes out, because quite a lot of it then gets suppressed because jazz is degenerate music, and he gets thrown out in 1933.
That's right. So I mean, we do have these famous jazzalettes which we performed at the Royal College of Music last year, and I mean they are really interesting because they are chamber music pieces. I mean, one could say that generally, as a chamber musician himself, he was a cellist in the in a quartet, the Lęczewski quartet.
The Lęczewski, that's right. Yes, right.
And so he plays chamber music, and he also composes for chamber music groups. So the jazzalettes were, of course, performed by the students of the jazz class. Yes. And he also writes sort of music for studying jazz. Yeah. There's these rhythmische Studien as well for piano, and then the leichte Tänze as well, which are still, of course, very often played. So there are concerts, he plays in concerts, but in Frankfurt he also conducts. And he writes music for the radio. Yeah. And that's something we know from a document that you've shared with me. After the war, he launched a compensation claim against the German government for his unfair dismissal by the Nazis. And in that we have some information about his work in Frankfurt, and the fact that he conducted operettas and Singspiele, music theatre, in two of the main theatres in Frankfurt. And then he was a professor of jazz, and he was only in his, early 20s. Yes. It's quite remarkable, really.
Yes, when I went to Frankfurt, because they had celebrations in 2005 and 2010.
And then writing for the radio, for radio plays, I suppose, which later on, feeds into his work in film music as well. That's another strand that started in Frankfurt. So it was going really well for him there. And
yes, yes.
Do you think he would have left if he wouldn't have had to?
No, probably not. It was his second language. I think he was having a whale of a time. And as you say, he was probably quite well paid for his age. It's at that stage that he bought the summer house at Balaton Boglar, which, according to Keresztüri, he went to as often as he could because it gave him peace. And it was there as a summer house for his parents as well, but he obviously used it. So he did go back to Hungary quite frequently, I think. But no, I think probably he wouldn't have left Frankfurt.
Here I have got a quote from the New York Times, published in 1928. And this was after he had been appointed in Germany, and there was quite a scandal in the press.
Yes.
And this is a quote from the Allgemeine Musikzeitung in Germany, making a big point that this really is the wrong way to go for music in Germany. And they say, There are men who want to breed this monstrosity and to perpetuate it by planting its seeds in the fertile ground of the younger generation. Starvation alone makes our musicians swallow this loathsome food.
Wonderful.
At that time, it was felt to be a desirable thing to bring this freedom, this ease that's associated with jazz,
Yes.
and the rhythmical sophistication as well. So in the jazz class, they performed music by Gershwin, but also by Stravinsky.
Yes.
And I think it's interesting that there was it was meant to be an element of contemporary music, of contemporary musical skill. And what we haven't mentioned yet is that your father also starts taking an interest in 12-tone music, which, of course, Schönberg's school in Vienna and then in Berlin had cultivated. But he has his own take on this, and without being particularly closely connected with Schönberg, develops his own way of writing 12-tone music. And the second Jazzolette from the Frankfurt period already has this
elements in it,
has elements of 12-tone music in it.
Yeah. Yes, well, he never admitted that there should be barriers between genres of music. He didn't believe in that, and he got very stroppy with people who said that you can only have pure classical music or pure this. He didn't believe in that at all. So yes, I think he was taking an interest in Schönberg. I think when he got to Stockhausen, it got a bit too much, but Schönberg and Weber, yes. And the second string quartet, of course, is pretty solid 12-tone.
And that was written in began in Frankfurt?
Begun in Frankfurt, I'm not sure when it was finished.
And then, so in 1933, when the Nazis came to power, he lost his job in Frankfurt. And, he was immediately, without any professional, foundation to his life at all. And that's a very unfair thing. I mean, if you think about that and think about the success he had in Frankfurt and then this big disruption, I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, what does one think about the Nazis and what they did to people? It's not a nice picture. But he went back to Budapest and he found plenty to do. He became a music journalist. And he still travelled around quite a bit until, of course, then the Arrow Cross became rather more difficult in Budapest. So then he leaves Budapest and settles in London in 1935.
What do you know about this early time in London?
Not a great deal, because he never talked about it. He starts part-time at Morley College in 1942, but the sort of gap between 35 and 40 I know very little about, except I know that he was living in a sort of Hungarian enclave, which was based around Belsize Park. And that's where he became great friends with John Halas, Joy Batchelor, and started doing film music for them. And that goes all the way through propaganda films for the government, for BP, and all sorts of interesting things through the war.
He wouldn't have arrived as a refugee as such, right? It was people who came later on when persecution was getting really, really dangerous in Germany and in Hungary as well, of course.
Yeah.
People would have been then considered refugees, but when he arrived, he was,
No, still pretty open then.
But it was difficult. It was a difficult time for professional musicians at all, in general, in Britain. So finding work would have been incredibly hard. And so also there aren't any really serious compositions that continued in, for example, the line of the first and second string quartet and pieces like that all the time between 1935 when he arrived
after the war, yes.
I think in the 1940s when he started at Morley, he was in an environment again where there was more of stimulation to start composing in the serious way. But that doesn't mean that he didn't compose, because of course he had to make a living and find ways of doing things.
Yeah.
So there was the working for the accordion.
Oh, that's a wonderful story, yes. One of his friends was one of the Honer family who produced accordions, who complained to him that there was no good teaching manual for learning the accordion. So Mátyás goes off, teaches himself the accordion, and then produces a manual in 10 parts, which I think is still in use for teaching the accordion.
But I suppose that didn't give him the wider professional success he was hoping for.
No, but it came in small bits and bobs. I mean, he knew everybody, and certainly from the time in Hampstead, he had very large, wide contacts. If you look at the correspondence list in the British Library, I mean, it goes on to pages and pages and pages. There wasn't anybody he didn't know. And they were all writing to him all the time and to each other, which is interesting because all these contemporary musicians, composers at that time were constantly writing to each other, saying, what about this? And I liked such and such a piece and better than such and such a piece. So they are all in touch, however difficult that might have been. And of course he knew other Norbert Meyn from the Amadeus Quartet. So he finally gets to do the third string quartet for them. But he wrote for a lot of very well-known soloists. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's noticeable that, I mean, again, this document you shared with me of the compensation claim actually lists his income in the time up to the war, then during the war, and then also after the war. Yeah. And from that one, we can see very clearly that after the war, things did pick up, even from 1942 onwards, really, when he started at Morley. But the first years, and that's, I mean, it's 7 years from 35 to 42, I think must have been economically very hard. And then, of course, I mean, we know that he had a job as a music advisor for Schotts, for the publishers in London.
And of course, he, as well as Joy and John Haas in Hampstead, his other great friend there was George Mikesh. And he and George Mikesh, between them, ran something called the Podium, which was a sort of cabaret club, which attracted a lot of foreign émigrés. And there's this wonderful cartoon of him playing the piano and George Mikesh sort of prancing around on top of it. In the émigré scene, humour, of course, played a really important role, and it was, you know, people really needed being cheered up, and even in the internment camps on the Isle of Man, which he did not have to attend because he was Hungarian, or, you know. Well, he was here early enough for that not to count, but Norbert Meyn, of course, and the other Amadeus people were there. But the Podium Club, I think, I know very little about, but the Hungarian Cultural Centre are trying to revive an evening of it, which was supposed to happen last year and of course didn't. So that could be interesting. Yeah, but George Mikesh, I mean, famous through this book, How to Be an Alien, and really struck a chord with the with the British as well. It strikes me that, you know, there was enormous talent, and of course also, you know, during the war, you know, people had to deal with so much emotional stress. I mean, well, Dad did two little operettas for the Hungarians during that period, Bakers of Pelagi and Balaton, which I think are only ever been done in Hungarian. And they were part of the Podium cabaret sort of, I think so, yes. Time. Wow. And when I went, I took the Hungarian ambassador to Cambridge University Library some years ago, and they produced something for me which I'd never seen, which is called Boscu or Bosu, which is another one at that period. But I had to tell them it wasn't actually in his handwriting. Somebody had copied it out for him, although it was attributed to him as the composer. But it was from the same era. I think through his work at Schott that he met Michael Tippett, who then invited him to teach at Morley College. Yeah. And that was a community that included many different émigrés, and there was Walter Goer, for example, was involved. Yes, I think he was attached. I mean, Dad was always sort of part-time attached, so I never got to see much about Morley College, apart from when they did the celebrations in 2005 and 2010.
Yeah, so I mean, he was part of this group there, and there were, I mean, even Britten and Peers were connected with Morley College and the community there.
Well, he composed a lot for Peter Pears. One of the soloists he was in favour of. Dennis Brain, horn player, was another. Tibor Varga and Max Rostar, violinists, not that they were here, but...
Yeah, so these are all names that, in the 1940s and 50s were
known, yes, and Julian Bream would be the other one.
And you also mentioned already that he was starting to write music for radio and film again.
Yes.
And that's something that obviously, he'd started to do in Frankfurt, and of course it became a major part of his professional life in Britain. But during the war, he was writing for the Ministry of Propaganda, you call it?
Well, Halas and Batchelor were commissioned to do quite a few propaganda films, yes. And BP also commissioned them.
And there was a film for, basically outlining the foundations of the NHS.
Yes, that's after the war, but yes, to your very good health. And there was a whole series called Charlie, which Halas and Batchelor did, which has some wonderful short ones. And really, To Your Very Good Health was a sort of further development after that. But then, of course, there are other films which were had major music scores attached. Would be Magic Canvas, where the music was actually written first.
That's a fantasia, isn't it? And it's for string quartet and then horn and flute. So it's a small chamber ensemble again. Yeah. And that's a really interesting. I mean, it's an amazing film.
One can find it totally on YouTube, abstract. Actually. Yes, it is abstract. Yes, but it was done after the music, which is very interesting.
And it's a sort of images of a sort of soul flying through the universe, really. And it's
sort of escape from a cage, and how you then can't properly escape. Sort of dancers not quite being able to detach themselves. Some wonderful images.
And of course, dance by then played an important part in your father's life as well.
Yes. I found the earliest thing I could find with them both on the same piece of paper is the concert in the Conway Hall, 1942, which has Dad and George Mikesh making most of the arrangements as far as I could see. But it also has Lilla Bauer as a performer. Mm-hmm. Now, she arrived in 38, so what happened between 38 and 42, I don't know.
But she was a principal dancer with the Ballet Jos in Essen, so she also had to get out of...
She left the Ballet Jos in 37, 38, went back to Budapest to set up her own company. And her last performance in Hungary was in Szeged on the open-air stage, where she did a production of Tragedy of Man by Imre Malach. And she still had her visa from the ballet days, and she went back to Budapest and said, what shall I do, to her parents? And they said, you've got a visa, get out. So she did.
You mentioned once that they may have met already in Budapest at some point.
She said that she'd been to a concert or something where he was, but not sort of met properly, I think, no.
So and that community of emigres with Mikesh and the Podium Club, and that was all in North London,
in Hampstead, yes, with the Halases and yes, a few others.
So your mother would have, met him certainly in that.
There were certainly events put on for Hungarian emigres, which he must have had something to do with. Yes.
Let's talk a bit more about your father as a composer. Now we know that in 1942, when he started at Morley College, he started to pick up, composition again. And there's certain strands of compositions that we know. And let's start with the folk songs. So he made arrangements of folk songs with all sorts of languages.
Well, yes, he was a linguist, and one of his very good friends was Bert Lloyd, A.L. Lloyd, who was another multilinguist. And they worked together on quite a few of the folk song titles, but I think one of the nicest is the Yugoslav folk songs, which he arranged. He had his own choir, Dorian singers, So he arranged a lot of choral music for them. The Yugoslav folk songs, Hungarian folk songs, and then of course there are the song cycles for solo, Greek, French, medieval French, and chanson populaire.
These were completely tonal compositions, but they were also incredibly well crafted, and they found their audience, and they found performers who, and they still are, performed and quite well known among singers in Britain today.
Certainly when I was in a choir I had to sing the Hungarian folk songs, yes.
Your father would have been conducting choirs, would have had conducted choirs already in Frankfurt. I think he was chorus mastering as well at some stage, and then that's something that became important in his life in Britain as well.
Yes.
So he conducted the choir at Morley College, we know that, and then he started the Dorian Singers.
He inherited them, but after he died, they couldn't find anybody else. They just of anything like the same stature, so I think they then dispersed. But yes, I went to several concerts where he was conducting the Dorian Singers.
So a lot of the folk song compositions were also, written for choirs. The folk song arrangements, and then there is another strand of vocal music that's exciting about your father, and that's the nonsense
songs. Yes.
And again, he started that in Frankfurt. So there were Christian Morgenstern settings, which also some of which we did in the concert at the Royal College, and the one like Das Naso-Beam, which is incredibly, it's almost expressionist poetry, isn't it? And also quite there are some sort of interesting compositional elements to that, which sort of point in the direction of 12-tone music.
Yes, and now you mention it, when early 2019 we went to Berlin, where they resurrected some of his Frankfurt music, which I'd never heard before. There's one called From the Bridge, which is hilarious, but also is, as you say, pointing in that direction. But I don't think it's published.
There's Ringelnatz settings from Latein, zwei Schweinekarbonaden, which is basically just
two pork chops.
Two pork chops, that's right. And then he does continue that also in choral music?
Yes, well, certainly the nonsense songs are for SATB settings, yes. And the Hungarian choirs love doing those. The Szeged University Choir came over here and sang those.
And those are in English, right?
Those are in English, yes. Yeah.
And then there's also the Edward Lear setting, The Owl and the Pussycat.
Yes. Well, that was again another Halas and Batchelor film. In fact, Vivian Halas and I agree it's our favourite one.
It's right. It's absolutely wonderful. It's sung by a tenor in this recording.
Yeah.
And it's The Owl and the Pussycat went to sea in a beautiful
green boat. Yes.
It's a very, very catchy melody. And again, it's just it's one of those pieces that has really entered the regular repertoire in Britain. I mean, it's set for guitar and violin.
Yeah.
But there's also a piano version. And it's being performed. A lot of our students at the Royal College of Music would have come across it at some stage. It's one of the really well-known pieces.
Yes. Well, again, that was I think the guitar was done for Julian Bream, along with the other song cycles, which are on the CD that Tyrone Landau did.
So after the war, he settled down with your mother. When did they get married?
April 46.
And then you were born in 49.
February 49.
Do you know where they lived?
Well, he moved into my mother's flat in Chiltern Court on Baker Street for a while. And then I think they were looking for somewhere to move out of London. And they found, first of all, a smaller house in Caterham. Caterham's in two bits, the hill and the valley, and this was in the valley, which Stafford Road runs along parallel to the railway line. So the first house we were in was quite a long way up Stafford Road, and that's where Kodály visited us when I was about 6 months old.
So that would have been in 1949?
And that was 1949.
And he kept in touch with Kodály,
Oh, yes. Well, Kodály, of course, couldn't get books in Hungary, so he was constantly asking Dad to send him books, which he did. And then, yes, on the day of the coronation in 1953, we moved into the new house, which was near the station, much further along Stafford Road, only 4 minutes walk from the station.
That's marvellous, and that was, you know, a really nice, comfortable place with a big garden.
Huge garden, there's an acre. So we had our own orchard of apple and pear trees and cherry tree, and vegetable, we grew most of our own vegetables, nut trees, and then behind us was a wood, so you could just walk out the back of the garden into the wood, which was what I did a lot of the time.
And he would have been, you know, working at home?
Yes, he worked from home. They'd built a music room on as an extension, so his Steinway was in there, and his desk, which is the desk I've got in my study, and he taught from there. I met most of the pupils who came to his house.
So that's the other really important element of his. I mean, you know, again, his versatility is staggering, but the fact that he developed this line of career as a teacher of composition is something we haven't mentioned yet. So he obviously started in Frankfurt, being a professor there, but then in Britain he took on pupils privately, and he taught composition at Morley College. Yes,
I mean, on the documents where he's asked to describe himself, he says as a teacher of composition. He doesn't say he's a composer.
And of course he is very, you know, highly regarded now and remembered as perhaps one of the most influential, if not the most important teacher of composition at the time. And so people would come to his house and have lessons, and he had and I suppose his wide you know, training and ability with music, with different musical styles. I mean, he was also interested in early music, wasn't he?
Yeah, oh yes, and playing chant and early music.
So that would have given him the perfect
clavichord, yes,
foundation. He even wrote music for clavichord. That's right. So the perfect foundation to teach and you know, bring students to music. And do you know what his teaching style would have been like, and what?
I think it was a bit like Kodály's style, which was to try and get people to produce something which he knew they had in them, which possibly they didn't know themselves. And Michael Graubart tells you the story, remember? He came for a couple of lessons, and Dad says, yes, very nice. So Michael went away and thought, I'm not having this, I'm going to produce something, and came back with something which he'd been really angry when he wrote it. And Dad said, well, I knew you had it in you. It's about time. And yeah, it was much the same, I think, with Hugh Wood and quite a few of the others. Malcolm Lipkin came, Walter Wutzberger, who's relatively later on the scene. But he also taught some people who were just interested in music and composition and not professional musicians. Mm-hmm. One of his, person he said had the most natural talent was Ottavio Negro, who was not a musician at all.
So now it's raining again outside, and we've had to close the
doors
here. So we were talking about his teaching, but of course, you know, while he was busy teaching, he was also increasingly in demand as a composer. And there were, we talked about the film music already, but he also, of course, was engaged in cutting-edge contemporary music. One of the things that we know is that he co-founded the Society for the Promotion of New Music with Francis Chagrin.
Yes, well, I think the musical powers that be were having some difficulties accepting new music, so he thought it needed a union of sorts to promote it, and he and Francis and a few others got together and set up what then became the SPNM, yes.
And they would put on concerts regularly, and they would give young composers the possibilities to perform their music. But also, I mean, some of his music was also performed at the SPNM events.
Yeah.
I mean, we know that actually in the 1940s, there were 8 of your father's works performed at the SPNM events. And they also created what it was called a recommended list, which they then made available to the BBC, for example, for broadcast and further promotion. And then several of his works made it onto that. So I mean, it was and just really talking about the kinds of works we're talking about here. It is chamber music. It is partly atonal chamber music. It's music that really pushes the boundaries. And of course, as a teacher of composition, he would have been involved in those kinds of developments. So we talked about the first and second string quartet already. Now the third string quartet was also written for the Amadeus.
For the Amadeus, yes.
What's the music like, and the third string quartet especially, and how would you describe it in comparison to the earlier pieces?
Well, I think there's an interesting progression. I mean, the first is very much being taught by Kodály at the Academy and Bartók. The second is interested in serial music, and the third is much more rounded, more accessible, I think, to most people, and it certainly gets performed more. There will be a performance in the autumn by the Villiers Quartet here, and they've done it before. Of course, it was done in Budapest last September, which I was going to go to, but then couldn't for COVID reasons.
And then there is other vocal music. I mean, for that song cycle which he wrote for the tenor Peter Pears, to poetry, which is again,
which you've done, yes.
I enjoy singing that very much. It's a really it's a very widely conceived piece. I mean, it's got poetry by Goethe. In English translation, It's got Shakespeare said. It's got a text that's associated with English early music, a song, an anonymous poem that we know through a John Dowland song.
Yes.
And then there is an old Scots poem which is really, really heart-wrenching about the fear of death.
Timor Mortis.
Yes. It's something that in mellow English musical tradition is hard to imagine that something as hard-edged as Timor Mortis could have been written. Obviously Peter Pears sang it, and it's a fabulous piece in the repertoire.
I think so, yes. And the other Peter Pears premiere, of course, was Ulysses.
And Ulysses is that's a big piece for choir, soloists, and orchestra.
And orchestra, yes.
And it's based on James Joyce's Ulysses.
Yeah.
And that was premiered at Morley College.
At Morley, yes.
And it's a groundbreaking piece in many ways. It's got it's been performed all over the world, hasn't it?
Yes. Yes, I last heard it in New York in Carnegie Hall in 2010.
So it's an amazing piece, and then there is the other 10 years later, the Joyce setting, the portrait of the artist as a young man.
Yes.
And what's that like, and where has that been done?
That is also on our CD. We did a Joyce setting CD. Can't remember where I heard it last live.
But it's for speaker as well, and
yes.
and chorus and orchestra.
Yes.
So these are pieces, and I mean, in terms of other orchestral pieces, which ones stand out for you?
Well, he preferred chamber anyway. I suppose the other innovative one is the improvisations for jazz band and orchestra, which he did with Johnny Dankworth. Mm-hmm. And that's quite late on. He complained about Johnny Dankworth endlessly in his letters. I can't understand this young man. He doesn't turn up for meetings, he keeps changing dates. And I think also part of the problem with Dankworth was that he wanted everything to be improvised. And Dad said, you can't do that with an orchestra. You've got to write it down. And Johnny wouldn't write it down, so Dad eventually had to write down most of it, I suspect.
So there were sort of properly, composed, and then sort of improvisation sections in that piece.
Well, no, Dad was trying to say you can't do that with an orchestra. It's all very well for you to be on your saxophone, but it doesn't work if you've got other people involved as well.
There's a violin concerto as well, and then there are. Where does that fit for you?
The 1961 is supposedly very difficult for the violin, but when it was done for either Tibor Varga or Max Rostar.
Mm-hmm. And they were both, Tibor Varga was Hungarian.
But living in Switzerland, yes. Yes, we used to go and visit them near Sion.
And Rostal was, of course, an important figure in the scene in Britain, and he was the person who taught most of the members of the Amadeus Quartet during the war, and helped them along. So this is there is a community around here.
Yes, the roots and branches reach out a long way.
And then there were several dozens of films that were written in late 50s.
A lot for Halas and Batchelor, including Animal Farm, which is the first full-length animation film. It was done in 1954, but of course it was banned in Hungary by the Soviets. So in 2005, there's an animation festival at Kecskemét, which is where the Kodály Institute is, and they wanted to show Animal Farm, and they invited Vivian Haas, and she said, you've got to invite Julia as well. So we met there for the first time for 40 years and had an absolutely wonderful time when they showed Animal Farm, which many people had not seen. And then after that, yes, with the commercial films as well. Town Like Alice, I suppose, is the best known, and Chase a Crooked Shadow. Mm-hmm.
So we know a lot of emigres in Hollywood, of course, built their careers around film music, but he did sort of some of that here in Britain as well. And Animal Farm is an absolutely groundbreaking animation film, and it's got a brilliantly written film score, which again is sort of chamber music based, very expressive, and actually really makes you. It's quite a skill to bring animals to life with music in this way, and so it's a very powerful score. So I would really recommend people to watch that. It's a marvelous film.
Oh, it is.
The skill of theatricality, I suppose, through music that also comes in the radio plays. There was a big long radio play based on Goethe's Faust as well,
yes.
Which he wrote music for, and then he also wrote for the famous Hoffnung festival.
Yes, and, Gerard was a good friend, so he did a lot of music for the 1958 Interplanetary Music Festival, which I went to as a very young kid, I remember.
So he would have been 9 or so?
Yeah.
So that's also an incredible bit of history, isn't it? Gerard Hoffnung, who was also an émigré, a caricaturist, absolutely, super talented.
Wonderful tuba player as well, yes.
He made drawings for all the major newspapers and even in America, and was, very, very well known, and also became a radio broadcaster. Yeah. Huge sense of humor. Quite a sort of treasure, really, a national treasure in Britain in some ways. And then he develops this obsession with the tuba, plays the tuba in Morley College Orchestra, and then goes on and puts on concerts in the Royal Festival Hall. He wasn't, he was in his 30s then, I suppose. He was very young still as well.
He was very young, yeah.
And such a grand character. And so it's called the Famous Tay
Whale, yeah.
It's been recorded, and it's an amazing piece the tuba features very prominently in it. It's full of sort of brilliant theatrical timing.
Yes, and it is very, very well. The phrasing is just wonderful. Yes.
Connection with Hoffnung is also,
Yes, and of course Hoffnung's portrait of him I have here. My great inspiration.
He also, of course, stayed in touch with many musicians. We mentioned the SPNM, the Society for Promotion of New Music here, but there was also the International Society for Contemporary Music, which picked up quite a lot of your father's compositions, and they were played at their conferences and meetings.
He was always going to the music conferences, yes, all over the place, yes. Tel Aviv, the States, Paris, Oslo, as we mentioned. One of his pupils was Ingvar Littholm, so he went to Sweden as well. That and Switzerland and Germany.
And that's all after the war, and so there was that he had a good base in Britain, and he travelled all over Europe again. Yes. Do you think he ever considered moving to Europe again, to sort of continental Europe again?
Well, no, there was no need, was there? In those days, you could still get from this country to anywhere else you wanted. We didn't have Brexit, although we weren't part of the EU. There was wasn't the sort of stigma that they're importing now. No, he just travelled wherever he wanted, and that was fine. He went back to Budapest once in 1956, and somebody warned him to get out early. He came home on October the 20th. The uprising started on the 23rd. So I'm not entirely sure who warned him to go, but somebody clearly did, because he wasn't due to come home until the 24th.
So he was very lucky to get out by then.
Yeah.
And he corresponded with everybody.
Well, yes, I mean, the list of his correspondence in the BL is staggering. Is there anybody he didn't correspond with?
Just mention a few more people that he was friends with. Hans Keller.
Hans Keller, certainly, yes. They used to really wind each other up, I think. But then there's that letter he wrote to Hans, which has just come out in the book about Hans Keller, which Dad says that he's the one person he can really open up to and have a good musical discussion with.
I mean, Hans Keller was, of course, he was a violinist and writer and broadcaster for the BBC, and really introduced Britain to. But
a music intellectual,
music.
And yes. not like anybody else, I think. My mother didn't like him very much, but.
Well, he certainly was a controversial figure.
He was controversial, yes.
Yeah, so they were friends, and then there was also Ligeti, who
Ligeti,
he was,
yes, yeah.
In connection. Do you know how that connection came about?
No, but I mean, Ligeti would have been at the academy way after he was. Mm-hmm. But, Hungarian musicians tended to get in touch with each other. A lot of them contacted Dad in the 50s to try and get help with various things because they were having problems at home, even the ones who didn't get out.
And Ligeti also eventually left Hungary.
He did, yes. Yeah. And his great friend also, Erich Ito Kahn, from Frankfurt days, he finally got out and went to the States. And there's correspondence with Milton Babbitt about Kahn and his wife Frida arriving in the States and they were being okay. I think Dad had something to do with them getting out, but I'm not entirely sure what.
So that's also, he's a composer, Erich Ito Kahn, also a really important connection.
And when he died, clearly Dad was very upset. The Viola Elegy is written for that.
To commemorate his friend.
Yeah, a very bleak piece, I think.
So your dad travelled a lot?
A lot, yes.
And then he also travelled to South Africa?
Yes.
Could you tell us what happened there and what do you know about this?
Well, Spike Glasser had been one of his pupils for a long time.
Is that Spike or Stanley Glasser? Or
well, he was always called Spike by his friends, yes. Stanley Glasser, yes.
And who was he?
He was a musician. He was at Witwatersrand University, and he got them to invite Dad to do a concert and conducting tour. And he was there for 3 weeks. He'd actually finished the tour, and they took him to the Kruger National Park for a day off before he came home. And the car went into a pothole, the axle broke, and he was thrown out of the car. No seat belts in those days.
So was he alone in the car?
Oh no.
Do you know who else was in that?
I think Spike was there and one other person, I don't know, but nobody else was hurt.
You found out through...
Spike's brother lived in London and he came to see my mother the next day.
There were two, wonderful tributes to your father by Kodály, his teacher.
Yes.
And also by Ligeti, who both wrote...
They both wrote pieces, yes.
Pieces for him.
Yes, I think the Kodály pieces shows he did value his best student. Yeah.
And then there was a memorial concert as well.
Yes, a memorial concert, and the other obituary was written by his brother-in-law, Keresturi, which has been translated for me. And that tells me quite a lot about his early life, which I wouldn't have known otherwise. Mm-hmm.
And then you were with your mother?
And then I was with my mother, yes.
So let's talk about your mother now, because she was, of course, quite something, and also a great artist in many ways. So tell us a bit more about your mother's background and family.
Yeah, I know a lot more about her family than I do about my father's. Her father, Lilla Bauer, was a well-known architect, and a lot of his buildings still exist in Budapest. I've been taken round them. And they include the Corvin Theatre, as it's now called, which is the first semicircular cinema that was built. Mother, I think, was just a housewife and a good cook, and interested in collecting embroidery, which I now have a large amount of. Mum was the youngest of 3 daughters. She didn't get on with her middle sister at all. The eldest sister, she said, was very close to the parents. So quite where this sort of sprite came from, who then was talent spotted and joined the ballet, I don't know. But she was only 19, I think, when she joined the ballet. And she was in his most famous production, The Green Table, where she danced as the young girl. And in several others. I think she was in something which is called the Pavan for the Death of the Infanta, which I've only just found the title of, but Heine Heckroth, who was the costume designer, gave her a picture of the costumes, and I think it must be from that.
Could you help me with placing this both geographically and also in time?
They were in Essen when she joined them in 1932.
So she trained in Budapest as a dancer?
There were 2 dance schools in Budapest. I'm not sure which one she was at, although one could probably find out. And then she joined the ballet.
And that was when?
In 1932.
1932.
She was in Essen. 1934, the ballet came to Dartington Hall because Essen was getting a bit difficult for the likes of Curtius. And they were in Dartington for a year or 18 months. And there are photographs of her dancing on the lawn there, doing exercises. Then the ballet went on tour, and she went to the States, she went to France, she went to lots of places. And in 1937-38, she decided to go back to Budapest and form her own company. And it was during that time that she did this production of Tragedy of Man in Szeged in the open air theatre, which is there from June to September every summer, which I have seen many times. But the interesting part of her life at that stage was that she had a 5-year relationship with somebody called Budai, Georgi Budai, who was a very well-known woodcut artist. And when she left, She was a good friend of Marianne Reisman, who was a well-known photographer. She left her letters with Marianne, saying, if I don't come back to Hungary, destroy the letters. And she left in 1938 and came to London. The letters were not destroyed. So she was extremely surprised to get a letter from the Pertufi Museum in 2006, I think, asking to display her letters as in an exhibition of Budai's work. And she was horrified, but they sent her copies and she said, all right. He was a young man very much in love. And yes, they went on display with one print of her that was in the brochure. The interesting thing is that Budai came to London in 1938, at the same year that she did. She, by that stage, is married to somebody else called Vilmos Levy, a sculptor, and then got divorced from him fairly quickly. Vilmos Levy changed his name to Peter Lambda, and he did a bust of Anorin Bevin. But I also have a bust he did of my mother. Anyway, Budai is now in London and set up what then became the Hungarian Cultural Centre. So he's around, and there is one letter between him and my father. I'm not sure what about, presumably about what then became the Hungarian Cultural Centre. He came from Szeged, and we've been twinned with Szeged since 1987, and I chair the Cambridge Szeged Society since 2005. And about 2008, I think, Tibi Pap, who is the main organiser there, asked me to find out where Budai was buried, because they were thinking of having his remains exhumed. But because he died in a mental institution, he was buried on what's called sacrosanct land, and the bishops never allow people to be exhumed from there. So I had to tell Tibi, no, I don't think you'll be getting his remains back to Szeged. In 2019, I was looking something up about Budai, for something else entirely, and up popped that portrait of my mother, which I'd seen in the brochure for the Budapest exhibition. Only I looked at the bottom, it didn't say Budapest, it said it was in the British Museum. So I phoned the British Museum and got put through to the print room. Oh yes, they said, we've got two folders of his work. So I said, anything about Lilla in there? And he said, well, there is one that's called Lilla. So I spent the most extraordinary afternoon looking through the two folders of Budai's work, and I found 14 portraits of my mother. What he'd obviously done was follow the dance company around and done woodcuts of her. And the last one, 1937, it says it's done in Transylvania, because normally he didn't give a title, he just said where it was done, Rome, and the year, 1937. But this one says Transylvania, 1937, and it is just so absolutely quintessentially her. It's extraordinary.
That's a lovely thing to have, isn't it? Those amazing images of your very beautiful mother.
And I'm sure she didn't know there were these portraits in the British Museum.
And then after the war, she became a really important teacher of dance as well. Yes,
when she moved here in 1938, she started teaching in schools in the East End of London, and then was asked to join the staff at Goldsmiths. So she was lecturer in modern dance for the rest of her life. Well, the rest of her working life anyway. So she was part-time, then she went full-time again after my father was killed, until she retired.
Mm-hmm. And she lived in the house in Caterham?
She lived in Caterham, yes. Yeah. Until she was 98 and a half, when she had one fall too many, I think, and ended up in hospital. So we went to see her, and she said she didn't think she could go home safely, and I thought, no, you can't. So we found a care home for her, which was only 5 minutes walk from where Budai's grave was, which was also very strange, but I told these stories in Szeged in 2014 about their sort of interlocking lives, and they were just dumbfounded.
And did your mother stay in touch with this musical world of your father's? That's
No.
what I mean, because obviously there was so many amazing musicians all over the
Yes.
world that had known your father and were performing his music, and so what was her relationship to that?
Not really. I mean, Don Banks, who lived not that far away, we stayed in touch with. She was a very proud lady, and she didn't really think that she ought to have to keep in touch with them, I think. So if they didn't keep in touch with her, then it was dropped. A couple of people, yes, Ottavio Negro and Francis Oakes, they all stayed in touch, but the musicians on the whole not, apart from Don Banks.
And then, of course, you took on your own sort of journey of discovery, because you didn't get too much about your father's musical background through your mother, right? I mean, it's sort of...
Well, she told me a little bit, and about the concerts she'd been to, but no, he never told me anything, and she sort of kept equally quiet about it.
So then, really, by starting the Mátyás Seiber Trust in 2005, and then also through the connection with the twin cities,
the Cambridge
and
Szeged Society, yes.
and you helped to put on performances of your father's music in Hungary. So you
well, here and there, because the Cambridge Szeged Society doesn't get much funding from the City Council. So the way we can do concerts, which I don't charge tickets for, is to subsidise it from the trust. So the basis is that we have a piece of Seiber on the programme. And the other thing I use it to subsidise it is for the folk quartet that we know from Szeged to come over each year. And we do on the basis that was what Dad and Kodály were doing, so it's worth subsidising them as well. And they're lovely musicians. And yes, I've now taken 5 Cambridge choirs out, and they performed in Budapest, Kecskemét and Szeged.
And it's marvellous to use the money from the royalties, to keep that alive and to have that connection with Hungary. And through your own journeys to Hungary, and sort of on the retracing your parents' steps also, what have you learned about this your parents' history and also the history of Hungary and in relation to the émigrés here in Britain as well?
Well, we first went in 1990. Simon and I drove there, and we drove around the country, popped into Szeged. We'd only been twinned with it for 3 years then. Found my cousin in Budapest. She died in 2016, but before that, my other cousin, who is the daughter of the eldest of the 3 sisters, my cousin in Budapest was the daughter of the middle sister with whom my mother didn't get on. Anyway, the 3 cousins met up, and Eva took us round the buildings done by my grandfather, which still exist. So that was interesting. That was 2009. Yeah. So yes, I mean, it's been a long discovery, and I go to Szeged mainly, but you have to fly to Budapest in order to get there. And in 2005, the first CD was done in Budapest. I was contacted by the cellist Peter Szabó, who wanted to record it. And the pianist on that, Zsuzsa Kolar, she is a concert pianist, but she's also become a good friend, so I stay with her whenever I'm in Budapest.
So there is now some interest in your father's music in Hungary, but you also did say that during his lifetime, in Britain he was seen as Hungarian, and in Hungary he was seen as British.
Oh, well, that's continued throughout. Yes.
That, of course, would have made it a bit more difficult for his music to be properly championed. Do you think that this sort of well, how can we go forward with this sort of mix of identity that we have to deal with here? And so, yeah, where do you think the future is with that and with your father's music, and where does it go? Where does it belong?
It's interesting that the royalties have always been mainly from Germany. It's always been performed more in Germany than anywhere else. And that continues to be the case. The next CD is also being done in Germany. So I've just set up the agreement for that. And then hopefully there'll be a CD of the film music done here later this year. So the CDs have helped. I think we've got 6 Seiber ones and 6 mixed ones now.
And of course, I mean, Ulysses has been recorded, and you know, a lot of the music can be found on Spotify, and it's you know, utterly performable and utterly lovable. You know, it's fascinating that, you know, a lot of musicians that I've spoken to about your father, oh yes, I do know Mátyás Seiber, and they all have enthusiastic things to report about individual pieces that they have performed by him. But very few people actually know the full story.
Yeah.
And of course, it is a hugely complex story. It's got so many bits, you know, Hungary, and then Frankfurt, and then an ocean liner, and then this life in Britain where he wrote, you know, all sorts of different music, and then
and a pop song.
And a pop song, exactly. The Novello Award, which he got for
yes.
What's it called?
By the Fountains of Rome. Yes.
That's right. So there's the enormous craft, enormous achievement in his, you know, just the sheer sophistication of, you know, what he created and whatever he touched. So I mean, I just want to thank you, Julia, because you've helped to try to put this long story into an arch that hopefully people will enjoy listening to, and hopefully that gives people a chance to get a bigger and more complete picture of your father's life. But also thank you for sharing also things about your mother and this whole fascinating piece of history.
Well, thank you, Norbert. It's been a great privilege.
Thank you, Julia.
Great fun to find out as well.
Thank you.